Okay, this evening, the whole point of this evening, the lecture now, is that for a number of you guys, you're about to be kind of heading out into the world and you're going to be setting up your own studios, which is possibly one of the most exciting and important things you get to do as an artist. And so rather than just me talking about it, I think it's really useful to share this with the other people I teach with, because all of them in the course of their painting careers have set up spaces, have worked at home, have worked in purpose-built studios, have adapted spaces. And so it's really about sort of just some of the different ways we get to use space. And we're going to start off with a little kind of historical overview, and then we'll get into something a bit more specific and useful. Okay, why are we starting with this? The thing I love about looking at frescoes in a church is you're actually looking at an artist's studio. Like, he painted those there. So that is actually a studio space. So whenever you go into a Santa Trinita, Santa Croce, wherever it might be, you're actually going into an artist's studio space. I think sometimes maybe these things are so old or they're not the style we think we're working in. But every time I walk into a painter's studio, I get some sort of buzz. I'm in a space where someone's making things or someone's made things. And that for me, when I started really enjoying these paintings, was the first bridge. I'm actually walking into a space that someone's made paintings. In this case, over 700 years ago, which is also pretty amazing. In Florence, this is Vasari. This is an invented studio in 1550. So this is possibly Vasari here painting the Virgin, or St. Luke painting the Virgin. But you can see it's actually based on quite real things. So there's a guy preparing pigments or something in the background, people wandering through. And this is the bottega in Florence in the Renaissance. This is like 1450. And it's just this idea that, like, these amazing pointy shoes. But the bottega, both the workshop, the idea of the studio was a bottega. It was public, it was open to the street. And one of the theories Vasari talks about as to why the arts reached such an amazing level in Florence was because it was public. We tend to now, I very much do the same, lock myself away. Like, my studio is my refuge from the world. But in 1450, your studio was actually in a street. People would come in and they would see your work. And so if you knew that people were going to be scrutinizing your work, maybe that gave you an obligation to work to an even higher level. So this idea of we have this idea now of the studio as being a private space, but in the Renaissance it was a much more public idea. So passers-by would come in, he looks pretty unimpressed, would come in and potentially judge what you've been doing. Okay, now we're just a couple of little paintings of this is Rembrandt in his self-portrait, probably, of Rembrandt in his studio, and just a few little clues of things we're going to be talking about later. So you can see that whatever it is he's painting and the painting itself are receiving light. So this idea of the work itself being illuminated. One of the questions I've always wondered is the angle of the painting. Were his paintings angled like that, or is that a compositional idea?
Just amazing.
Yeah, I mean, if this was straight, would that be a less interesting painting? I think so. So people often use this as a justification for, Rembrandt's easel was like this. I don't know. I think he might be playing a trick on us. I don't know. I think it's also partly to make a better painting. That angle, you wouldn't be able to see it.
Okay, so much reflection.
Yeah, I mean, just imagine how much reflection you'd have with your painting at that angle. And he's standing back, but we also see maybe if he was doing a smaller painting, he'd have his feet resting here because the wood's a little bit more worn down. But whenever you look at things like this, and people go, there are these drawings of all those people in the French Academy. And they go, there were 25 million people there working like this. Well, maybe that's to make a better drawing too. You can't always trust these things. I think the things you can trust are the fact that there's really, the work itself, the canvas is receiving a lot of light, so his painting is illuminated. But the idea of the angle of the canvas, I'm actually very skeptical about. I think that's a compositional decision to make a better painting, for me anyway. And then other types of studio. There are, whether that's for painting inside or whether that's going to be sort of him having fun afterwards, I don't know. But studios can take on all sorts of different forms. And in the 19th century, what's his name? Daubigny also had a very famous studio boat. So if you want to paint on the river and give yourself more choice of angles, the studio doesn't have to be a space indoors. Like the 21st century, this idea of a purpose-built studio, we all have to be a little bit flexible, and this is an extreme version of that. Then we have a little section on kind of what you might call studio porn, like just gratuitously wonderful studios that are probably completely unrealistic. Interestingly, this is a drawing, so that it is a bit more tilted here. Does anyone know, does anyone recognize this maybe from books they've seen before? Anyone want to guess? We're in Paris in the 19th century. This is Sargent's studio. And so, we tend to work here with skylights. This time he has a really high, big north-facing probably window. But you can see how the different ways, there's curtains here, and then there are more curtains above, and then there are more curtains here. So though it's a big window, it's really about flexibility. So he could have the light coming in from, as it were, under the model's eye sockets, but also if all of this is shut and the model's posing here, you get a pretty steep light as well. So the point isn't really skylight or wall light. The idea is really, it's all about flexibility. And the kind of painting he was doing in there. And then this is his studio in Tite Street looking the other way, and you can just see the variety of stands, steps, furniture, and other things, obviously to make a better painting, but also to get the model at the right height and so on as well. Relatively light wall color perhaps compared to what we use here, but you could always block it off. But you can see that I think the other part of a studio that's sometimes neglected is part of it is a practical thing, and part of it is actually an exercise in interior design, in that you've also got to make the space that you want to go to. If there's another space in the city you live which you like more than your studio, you'll go there when you're having a bad day. So you have to actually also make your studio somewhere you want to be. And I think part of Sargent's thing here is actually just filling it with things that even if the let's say his sitter couldn't come or it was cancelled, well, he could paint that, he could draw that. He could put that into the background. So it was partly a practical decision and thinking about the light, but you can see even here, it's also an exercise to some extent in interior design. Also that when people came, they would feel comfortable. And they would think, that I want to come back here. One of the big battles is to get people, especially if you're going to paint portraits, is to get people to come back for a second, third, fourth, fifth, 10th sitting if you can. And if they don't like your room, they won't want to come, to put it very bluntly. So part of it's actually, there's the practical part of the studio, and then there's the challenge of interior design. This guy was pretty lucky. This is Zorn's patron. This is on the edge of Stockholm. I think he's called Prince Alphonse. And one of the things, if you walk around any city where there have been artists working, particularly in the 19th century, 18th century and beyond, and you see a gap in the street and you look up and you see these huge windows, you can often guess if it's north-facing, that was an artist's studio at some point. And so this is a north-facing facade of this thing. And looking up here, this was a friend of Zorn's who was also a painter himself, and this was his house, so it's he's all right. But he decided in the top floor of his house to make this studio, and this is me inside to give you a clue of scale. So that window starts a good sort of 6 or 7 feet off the ground and goes way up, and probably it's now decorated in a different way, but maybe back in the time, like Sargent, he would have had this array of blinds and other things to help him with the light. And then, how many of you have been here? Who's been to Madrid amongst you? Not yet. Okay, that's yeah. When this sort of strange moment is over, really, I think a crucial thing for all of you guys is to go to the Prado, to go to the Thyssen, and when you're in Madrid, to go and see the Sorolla house. Interesting, they keep this blocked off now. I think possibly when he was doing his portraits, he had this one open quite a lot as well. This is a big north-facing window, a bit like the wall window that Sargent has. When you're there, you have this. Again, people giving you an idea of scale. And this house is full of Sorolla's paintings and full of the objects he had in his studio as well. All these display cases, all these things were in the house when he was painting. So again, a bit like Sargent, it's the idea of, here's the window. It's perfectly worked out in terms of the light, but it's also a space that he would want to be in. His family were there, the kitchen was downstairs, but I want to be in the studio, I want to work. And that when people came to sit for him, when models came, they would feel comfortable and they would want to come back. I think it's an underrated part of making a studio, by the way, is actually making it your favorite space in the entire world. Don't know if you recognize these two guys. And the same thing. So we've seen now sort of ideal spaces, and this is trying to convert something which is not a studio into something which actually gives some of the best light of any contemporary art school in the world.